He could have had any woman in the Blackstone Range. The finest daughters of the finest families lined up for a chance, and he turned every last one of them away. People called Gideon Crow proud, stubborn, broken inside. But when a heavy-set woman named Eliza Hartwell stumbled into Creekfall with nothing but a worn coat and a past full of damage, the most sought-after man on the frontier did something nobody expected. He chose her. And that single choice set the whole mountain against him. Creekfall, Blackstone Range. Winter, 1871. The cold came early that year. By the first week of November, the passes above Creekfall had already iced over once and thawed and iced again, and the old-timers sitting outside Dolan's feed and dry goods were saying it was going to be a killing winter. The kind that took livestock first and then the weak, and then, if it held long enough, started in on everyone else. Gideon Crow paid those conversations no mind. He came down from his place in the upper range every 2 or 3 weeks to sell pelts, pick up supplies, and get back up before anybody had too much opportunity to talk to him. He was not a man who disliked people exactly, but he had learned, somewhere in his 34 years, that most conversations led nowhere worth going. You talked about the weather, you talked about whose cattle had wandered. You said things that filled silence and meant nothing, and then you went home and wondered why you felt emptier than when you started. So Gideon moved through Creekfall the way a man moves through a place he's passing, not settling. He loaded his mule, Burl, with deliberate efficiency. He paid what he owed, and pocketed what he was owed, and did not linger. He was a large man, not in the exaggerated way of a man who lifts things to impress people, but in the solid, unargumentative way of someone who had spent 15 years doing physical work at altitude. His hands were permanently rough. His jaw carried a beard that was not a fashion choice, but simply what happened when a man didn't bother. He was not handsome in any careful way, but there was something about him that women noticed. A kind of settled stillness in the way he occupied space, like he had already made peace with most of the things that other men were still fighting. That quality, combined with the fact that he had 300 acres of good elevated land, a sound cabin, and no wife, made him the most discussed unmarried man between Creekfall and the Harmon Valley Junction. The Aldridge family had made their first attempt in September. Margaret Aldridge was 22 years old and had been described as a beauty by nearly everyone in the valley, and she was not wrong to believe it. She had copper-colored hair she wore pinned carefully, and green eyes, and the kind of posture that comes from a mother who cared about such things. Her father owned the largest dry goods operation in Creekfall, and had recently acquired a parcel of grazing land to the east that would make any man's cattle operation considerably more viable. She had come to Dolan's on a Tuesday morning when she knew Gideon would be in town, and she had arranged to need help reaching something on the upper shelf. And when he had reached it for her without ceremony and handed it back and started to turn away, she had said, fairly directly for a woman of her era, "Mr. Crow, my father is having a supper this Friday. He'd be glad of your company." Gideon had looked at her, not unkindly, just directly, the way he looked at things. "I appreciate it," he said. "I won't be able to make it." He has some business he'd like to discuss, about the eastern grazing parcel. "I'm not looking to expand right now." Margaret Aldridge had blinked, because men in Creekfall did not turn down dinner with her father, and they absolutely did not turn down a chance to sit across from her. "Perhaps another time," she said, keeping her voice even. "Perhaps," Gideon said, which was his way of saying no without making a scene of it. He had loaded Burl and gone back up the mountain. The Hargrove girls had tried in October, both of them arriving at Dolan's on the same afternoon, which everyone later acknowledged was perhaps too obvious. Clara was the elder at 25 and Sylvie was 20, and they were both considered attractive women from a respectable family, and their father ran the town's only functioning sawmill, which made him the kind of man whose daughters you wanted to be connected to. Claire had been more direct than Margaret Aldridge. She had simply walked up to Gideon while he was checking the shoe on Burl's left foreleg and said, "There's a dance at the Colton barn on Saturday. I thought you might want to escort me." Gideon had straightened up and looked at her with the same kind of unhurried attention he gave to everything. He was not rude about it. He was not cold. He said, "I don't do much dancing." "You don't have to dance. Just come." "I don't think I will, but thank you." Clara had looked at him for a moment, trying to determine if he was shy or strange or simply impossible, and apparently settled on impossible because she had turned and walked back to her sister, and Sylvie had looked over her shoulder at Gideon with an expression somewhere between wounded and furious. By the time the story made its way through Creekfall, which took approximately 3 days, it had been embellished to the point where Gideon had been rude, dismissive, and had made some cutting remark about Clara's shoes, none of which had happened. But stories needed edges to travel, and the plain truth that he had simply said no thank you was not interesting enough to carry very far. By November, there was a specific kind of hostility toward Gideon Crow in certain corners of Creekfall. Not from everyone. He had men he traded with honestly, and a few he would have called something close to friends if pressed. Old Thomas Beaumont at the tannery, who had known Gideon since he was 19 and new to the mountain, and making every possible mistake a young man could make in high altitude in winter. Del Whitaker, who ran the post, and who was the kind of man who had no patience for gossip and therefore made a reliable conversation partner. The Colton brothers, who ranched to the north and had a healthy respect for anyone who could keep cattle alive above 4,000 feet. But the social architecture of Creekfall was largely controlled by its women, as was true of most frontier settlements, and the women had arrived at a consensus. Gideon Crow was either damaged or insufferably proud, and either way, he had insulted their community by rejecting its best offerings. Ruth Aldridge, Margaret's mother, was the most vocal about it. She was a sharp-featured woman with an organizational mind and the social reach of someone who had spent 2 decades carefully cultivating every relationship in the valley. She held, in various ways, influence over credit at her husband's store, invitations to the events that mattered, and the general temperature of opinion in Creekfall. She had a particular skill for saying things once, quietly, and having them travel loudly. What she said, after her daughter's rejected invitation, was something along the lines of, "There's something off about that man. A man who won't take company when it's offered is either hiding something or there's something wrong with him that he knows better than to let anyone see." It was the kind of statement that sounded like concern, but functioned like a wound. People turned it over in their minds and found themselves agreeing with it, even if they couldn't have said exactly why. Boom. Gideon knew what was being said about him. You couldn't winter in a small settlement and not know. Walls were thin in Creekfall and sound carried, and he had good ears. He didn't particularly care. He had reasons for his choices that he didn't feel compelled to explain to anyone. He had watched men in this valley take wives for the land that came with them, or the business connections, or because the woman was the kind of woman other men admired, and having her was a way of being admired by extension. He had watched those marriages from a distance and seen what they produced. A particular kind of unhappiness that neither party acknowledged because acknowledging it meant admitting the whole thing had been a mistake from the start. His father had married a beautiful woman because she was beautiful, and the marriage had been a precise disaster. Not dramatic, just hollow all the way through, like a tree that looks solid until you fall against it. Gideon had made himself a promise at 18, standing at his father's grave. He would not do a thing because he was supposed to do it. Not that one, not any other. He did not know yet how complicated that promise was going to get. Eliza Hartwell arrived in Creekfall on a Wednesday in the second week of November, on the back of a freight wagon she had hired from the Harmon Valley Junction with the last of whatever money she had. She was not the kind of arrival that Creekfall took notice of, which was perhaps appropriate since Creekfall was not the kind of place that made it easy to arrive in the first place. The town was functional rather than welcoming, a collection of weathered wood buildings assembled without much aesthetic consideration along the main road, with the range rising sharply behind it and the valley spreading out flat to the south. Eliza climbed down from the wagon with a travel case that was more patch than case at this point, and a canvas bag over one shoulder, and she stood in the main road for a moment looking at the town with the expression of someone who had been told something about a place and was now doing the quiet arithmetic of how different the reality was from what they'd heard. She was 31 years old. She was heavy-set, not in the soft way, but in the dense, solid way of a woman who had spent her life doing physical work and had built a body accordingly. She was not considered attractive by the standards Creekfall applied to women, which meant she was too broad in the shoulder and too thick in the waist, and her face was plain in a way that didn't soften into prettiness at certain angles. Her hair was dark, and she wore it pulled back practically. She had good hands, large, capable, calloused, and eyes that were a particular shade of dark gray that picked up whatever light was available. Nobody in the main road paid her much attention as she stood there. The freight driver had already started moving, and the two men sitting outside Dolan's glanced at her briefly and went back to their conversation, which told her more about her status in this place than anything anyone would have said outright. She went into Dolan's and asked if there was any work available in town. The man behind the counter, a narrow, efficient-looking man in his 50s named Dolan himself, looked at her the way he looked at every new arrival, which was as a category of transaction to be evaluated. He asked where she was coming from. She said Harmon Valley. He asked if she had references. She said she had a letter from her former employer, a mercantile in Harmon Valley, and produced it, and Dolan read it briefly, and his expression didn't change, which with Dolan was actually a moderate positive sign. He said he didn't have any work himself, but that Vera Colton sometimes needed help at the boarding house, and that if she was willing to take on laundry, there were a few families that might pay for it. He said it without warmth, but without cruelty, which was about as good as Eliza had learned to expect. She thanked him and left, and went to find the boarding house. Vera Colton was 63 years old and had been running the Creek Fall boarding house since her husband had died of a fever 20 years ago, and she had been forced to choose between that and something worse. She was a small, dense woman with a face that had given up on softness sometime in her 40s and settled into a permanent expression of practical assessment. She looked at Eliza in the doorway with exactly that expression. "You're looking for the room or the work?" she asked. "Both, if possible," Eliza said. Vera looked at her for another few seconds, doing something internal. Then she said, "I've got one room left and it needs cleaning before it's livable. The last boarder was not what I'd call tidy. If you clean it to my standard, I'll take 2 weeks off the first month's rate. Work is breakfast service and laundry twice a week. The pay is not good, but it's regular." "That sounds fine," Eliza said. Vera looked at her a moment longer, the assessment continuing. "You have people here?" "No." "Trouble following you?" "Not in the immediate sense," Eliza said. Something in the way she said it, the specific careful qualification of "not in the immediate sense," made Vera Colton take another look at her. Not with suspicion, exactly. More like recognition. "Get your bag," Vera said. "Room's at the top of the stairs." The first 3 days in Creek Fall, Eliza kept her head down and did the work she'd been given and did not initiate anything that could be called a social overture. She knew how these places worked. You were a stranger until you weren't, and the only way to stop being a stranger was time and demonstrated usefulness, and trying to rush either one always made things worse. She cleaned the room. She served breakfast. She learned the rhythms of the boarding house, which boards in the floor had some give, where the drafts came from, which window latch was unreliable. She picked up laundry from the 2 families Dolan had mentioned and returned it folded. She watched Creek Fall the way she watched any new place, which was carefully and from a slight distance. She noticed the Aldridge family's position in town, the particular way people adjusted their behavior slightly when Ruth Aldridge entered a room, the way the store credit system created a web of small obligations. She noticed the hierarchy among the women, who mattered and who was tolerated. She noticed which men were respected and which were simply loud. She noticed Gideon Crow on her 4th day in town, not because she was looking for him, but because she was standing outside the boarding house when he came down the main road on his way to Dolan's, and something about the way he moved through the space made her look twice. He was not performing anything. Most people in a town were performing something, even if they didn't know it, performing confidence or authority or friendliness or indifference. Gideon just moved. She didn't know who he was yet. She found out that evening when Vera Colton, who was not a woman who gossiped but was willing to explain context when asked directly, told her about the mountain man who had rejected every eligible woman in the valley and made himself the town's favorite mystery. "What do people say about why?" Eliza asked. "Ruth Aldridge says he's damaged," Vera said, in a tone that made her opinion of Ruth Aldridge's theories fairly clear. "I think he's just particular." "Is there a difference?" Vera considered this. "In my experience, the people who call particular damaged are usually the ones who needed somebody to be less particular." Eliza thought about that for a while after Vera had gone to bed. She met Gideon for the first time on a Thursday morning, 11 days after her arrival, under circumstances that were not designed for favorable impressions on either side. She had gone out at first light to bring in the water for the breakfast service. Vera's pump was at the back of the lot, a solid 20 yards from the kitchen door, and the November cold had started putting a skim of ice on the ground overnight. She was carrying 2 full buckets back toward the house when she misjudged the edge of the flagstone path in the dark and went down hard, both knees and one palm, spilling most of one bucket and a third of the other across the frozen ground. She was still down, doing a quick internal inventory of what she'd damaged. The palm was torn up, one knee ached seriously, when she heard boots on the path behind her. "You all right?" said a voice. She turned her head. A large man was crouching at the edge of the path, looking at her with an expression that was concerned without being panicked. He had a woodsman's coat on, and he was clearly in the middle of something else. She could see his mule at the far gate, loaded. "I'm fine," she said, which was true enough. "Your hand's bleeding." I noticed. She sat back and looked at the spilled water with a calculation about what she was going to do about breakfast service. "Sit still a second," he said, and before she could decide whether to argue with that, he had taken the 2 buckets, gone to the pump, refilled them, and brought them back. He set them down near her. Then he offered his hand to help her up. She looked at his hand for a moment and then took it, and he pulled her up in the steady, practical way of someone who was used to assisting with physical problems without making a production of it. He let go as soon as she had her footing. "Gideon Crow," he said, not as an opener for conversation, just as identification. "Eliza Hartwell," she said. He looked at her hand again. "That needs cleaning." "I'll manage." "Vera has carbolic in the kitchen cabinet on the left side, second shelf," he said, "if she hasn't moved it." Eliza looked at him. "You know Vera's kitchen cabinet." Something that was almost a smile moved through his expression. "I wintered here twice, years ago. The cabinet hasn't changed." He picked up one of the buckets. "I'll carry one." The path's worse toward the door. She did not argue with this because her knee was hurting and her hand was dripping slightly on the frozen ground, and she had learned a long time ago the difference between independence and unnecessary pride. They went to the kitchen door, and he set the bucket down, and he went back to his mule without another word. Eliza stood in the kitchen doorway holding the other bucket and watching him go with an expression she was not examining too carefully. She had not expected him to think about that morning afterward. She had not expected, therefore, to be surprised when he did. 2 days later, she was at Dolan's picking up a supply order for Vera when Gideon came in and stood at the counter doing his own business. He glanced at her hand. The palm was still bandaged, and said, "Better?" "Better," she said. That was all. He finished his business and left. But there was something in the acknowledgement, the simple fact that he had registered her as a specific person rather than a figure in his peripheral vision, that was different from how most of Creekfall was treating her. She did not build anything from it. She was not in the habit of building things from small moments. She had learned, through a series of expensive lessons, that small moments were just small moments until they became something else, and the becoming had to be allowed to happen on its own. The something else started approximately 2 weeks later, in early December, when the first real storm of the season came down from the upper range. It came in overnight, the kind of storm that announces itself to the weather-aware around dusk, with a particular stillness and the smell of serious cold in the air, and arrives by midnight with real conviction. By morning, the main road had 18 inches of new snow, and the temperature had dropped to somewhere that Eliza, who had grown up in the lowland settlements, had never personally experienced. The boarding house's back wall had developed a problem. A section of chinking between the logs had failed sometime in the night, and cold air was coming in with the kind of sustained efficiency that was going to make heating the place an exercise in waste. Vera had found it at first light and was looking at it with the expression of a woman calculating what this was going to cost her. Eliza looked at it. "I can fix that," she said. Vera looked at her. "You know chinking?" "I learned some things." She had learned some things. This was a characteristic way Eliza referred to the various competencies she had accumulated out of necessity in the 12 years since she'd left her family's farm. A list that included rudimentary carpentry, basic livestock care, some field medicine, rough leather work, and the capacity to endure cold and physical discomfort without significant complaint. These were not skills she had chosen. They were skills she had needed. She spent the morning on the back wall with the tools Vera had in the shed, and the chinking held, and Vera looked at it in the afternoon with an expression that had shifted several degrees towards something warmer. Gideon showed up at the boarding house door in the late afternoon, which surprised Eliza because she hadn't thought he was still in town. He had stayed, apparently, because the storm had blocked the pass road, and going back up to his place was not a reasonable proposition until it cleared. He was at the door asking Vera about a room for the night when he noticed the repaired wall section. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at Eliza, who was in the kitchen doorway drying her hands. "That's good work," he said, not complimenting her, stating a fact, which was different. "It'll hold the season," she said. The original chinking was old. He looked at the wall again. "Where'd you learn that?" "Around," she said, which was the shorthand she used when the full answer was too long and too complicated for casual conversation. He seemed to understand that the answer was deliberate in its vagueness, because he didn't push it. He just nodded, and Vera gave him the room, and that was that. Except that at dinner, Vera served a communal meal when the boarding house was full, which, with 2 additional travelers stranded by the storm, it was... Gideon sat across from Eliza, and at some point during the meal, they got into a conversation about the upper ranges terrain that lasted the better part of an hour. He asked questions about whether she'd done much travel in high-altitude country. She told him about a winter she'd spent in a settlement east of the Harmon Valley, higher up than Creekfall, harder conditions. He listened with the focused attention of someone who was actually interested in what you were saying, rather than waiting for his turn to talk. When she described how the settlement had managed water supply when the primary source froze, a system of snowmelt and storage that she had helped engineer, he stopped eating for a moment and looked at her. "You built the melt system yourself?" he said. "Helped build. There were 3 of us who figured it out. Took most of November. Did it work?" "It worked until April. Then we dismantled it because we didn't need it anymore." He was quiet for a moment. "That's smart." "It was necessary," she said. Necessary and smart usually end up being the same thing. Something in his expression shifted slightly. A small recalibration, the kind that happens when you've been thinking about someone as one category of thing and they say something that doesn't fit the category. The storm lasted 3 days. In those 3 days, a pattern established itself that neither of them planned or named. Gideon was in town, with nowhere else to be. Eliza was working. They were in proximity. And they kept ending up in conversation, not the manufactured kind, not the kind where someone was performing interest, but the kind that develops when 2 people find each other genuinely interesting and neither one has much patience for anything that isn't genuine. He talked about the upper range in a way that made it clear he loved it, not sentimentally, but practically, with the particular affection of someone who had learned a place deeply, and what he described was less landscape than system, a web of weather patterns and animal behaviors and seasonal shifts that he had spent years learning to read. She listened to this and understood it better than most people would have, because she thought about places the same way. She talked about Harmon Valley and what had happened there, not all of it, but enough. A situation with her previous employer that had ended badly, a man who had promised her things and then denied promising them when it became inconvenient, and the way that kind of betrayal had a way of spreading, the way people in a small settlement tend to side with whoever has more to lose. She had left with what she could carry and found a way forward. Gideon listened to this without offering opinions about it, which was the correct response. He didn't tell her she should have done it differently or that it would be all right. He just heard it, which was more valuable than most people's advice. On the 3rd day, after the pass road had been declared passable, he was loading Burl to head back up, and Eliza was bringing the last of Vera's breakfast dishes in from the dining room when he stopped at the gate and said, without quite looking at her, "There's a lot of winter left." "There is," she said. "If the storm blew the south-facing slope hard, my woodpile's going to be buried." He looked at Burl's load, making some calculation. "I'll be back down in 2 weeks, maybe less." She stood there for a moment in the cold with the dish towel over her shoulder, understanding that this was not a conversation about weather or firewood. It was something else, offered in the careful, indirect way of a man who had gotten used to keeping his intentions quiet. "I'll be here," she said. He nodded, clicked to burl, and went up the road. The trouble with Creek Falls started the day after. Ruth Aldridge had noticed Gideon and Eliza eating dinner together on the second storm day because Ruth Aldridge noticed most things in Creek Fall and made it her business to give them meaning. She had said something to Margaret that evening, and by the following morning it had moved into wider circulation. Gideon Crow, who had turned down the valley's finest women, had spent 3 days in conversation with the heavy woman from nowhere who was doing laundry at Vera Colton's boarding house. The general response in Creek Fall to this information was the specific, complicated kind of contempt that comes from wounded pride. It was one thing for Gideon to be indifferent to the town's admired women. That could be explained as peculiarity, damaged judgment, some internal flaw that made him incapable of recognizing value. But to show visible preference for Eliza Hartwell, a woman with no family here, no land, a troubled history in her previous settlement, a body that didn't fit the valley's standards, that was a different kind of insult. That suggested his rejection of the admired women wasn't about some private damage. It was about them specifically. Eliza became aware of the shift the way she became aware of most changes in social climate, gradually and through accumulated small data. The two women who had been moderately friendly at the well became cooler. The supply runs for Vera took slightly longer because people seemed to be marginally less helpful. When she came into Dolan's, the conversation in the room didn't stop exactly, but it adjusted. She had experienced this kind of thing before. It had a texture and a temperature she recognized. She did not tell Vera about it. Vera probably knew. She did not adjust her behavior because she had learned that adjusting your behavior under social pressure was a kind of confirmation of whatever story was being told about you. She just worked and waited and tried not to spend too much time thinking about a man up the mountain whose firewood might be buried in snow. He came back in 11 days, not 2 weeks. The pretext was a trade at Dolan's, and it was real enough. He had furs to sell. But he appeared at the boarding house an hour after the trade with no stated business reason. Vera let him in without comment. She was good at that. He and Eliza sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours while Vera was occupied elsewhere, and the conversation was different this time. Not exploratory the way it had been during the storm, but more settled, like two people who had already established something and were now filling in the details. He told her about the upper cabin, the layout, the south wall that was perpetually problematic, the spring that came out of the rock face 30 feet above and ran down a channel he'd dug himself and froze in the worst winters, and what he did when it froze. She told him more about the years between her family's farm and Harmon Valley. Not the clean version, but the actual version. The years of moving between situations that offered partial solutions to the problem of being a woman alone with no resources and no family backing. The work she'd done. The calculations she'd had to make. The places where the math had worked out and the places where it hadn't. He listened to all of it. At one point she said something self-deprecating. She couldn't remember afterward exactly what, just some offhand acknowledgement that she understood she was not what people generally considered when they thought about a woman worth investing in. And Gideon looked at her with an expression that was almost irritated. "Stop that," he said. She looked at him. "The thing you just did," he said, "qualifying yourself down before someone else can do it. Stop it." She was quiet for a moment. Nobody had said that to her before exactly, or not in that way. Not as a directive, not with that small edge of actual displeasure at the behavior. "It's practical," she finally said. "It's not," he said. "It's a habit. There's a difference." He wasn't wrong, and she knew he wasn't wrong, and she sat with that for the rest of the afternoon. By the third visit, which was 2 weeks before Christmas, the situation in Creek Fall had crystallized. Owen Aldridge had approached Gideon at Dolan's during his second visit and had made a business proposal that was not really a business proposal. He had framed it as an opportunity, the eastern grazing land, favorable terms, and he'd mentioned Margaret's name in a way that was not quite accidental. He said he'd always respected Gideon's operation and thought there might be ways to be mutually beneficial. Gideon had said he appreciated it, but wasn't looking to partner up on anything right now. Aldridge had pushed slightly in the controlled way of a man who was accustomed to people eventually coming around. He had made a remark that was ostensibly offhand about how the boarding house crowd was a rough set and how a man in Gideon's position ought to be careful about who he associated with. Gideon had looked at him steadily for a moment and said, "I know who I'm associating with." Aldridge had left without the conversation going any further, but the message had been delivered and received, and within 24 hours, Creekfall knew that Gideon Crow had more or less explicitly chosen Eliza Hartwell over everything the Aldridge family was offering. The opinion of the town divided at that point, not evenly. The Aldridge faction, which was substantial, landed hard on contempt. Gideon had lost his mind, or his judgment, or both. He was going to regret it. A man couldn't live on stubbornness and whatever misplaced sympathy he felt for a woman who had showed up from nowhere with a bad history. The smaller faction, which included Thomas Beaumont and Del Whitaker and the Colton brothers and Vera, didn't say much, but they didn't say the other things either. On his third visit, Gideon arrived at the boarding house and Eliza came to the door and could see from his face that something was different. Not wrong, but decided. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and said, in the direct manner that was characteristic of him, "I want to ask you something, not a small thing." She stood in the doorway and looked at him. "I've been thinking about the winter," he said. "The upper place is more than I can work well alone. There's a second room and a sound roof and enough laid in to last through spring. And I've been thinking about whether you'd want to come up." He was not dressed up about what this meant and what it wasn't. He said, "I'm not asking you to make promises. I'm asking you to consider it. See if it's something. You'd have your own room and your own standing, and you'd do that on your terms." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. Outside, Creekfall was quiet and cold, and the light was going thin in the way it went in December when the dark came early. "People will talk," she said, not as an objection, as a data point. "They already are," he said. "I stopped caring about that sometime in September." She thought about Harmon Valley and the careful calculations she had spent 12 years making, the way she had learned to see any possible good thing and immediately start looking for the way it would turn bad. The habit of preemptive disappointment. She thought about what he'd said to her at the kitchen table. It's a habit, there's a difference. And the particular small irritation in his voice that had meant he was saying it because he thought she was worth saying it to. "I'd need a week to settle things with Vera," she said. His expression didn't change much, but something in his posture did. "Take what you need." He put his hat back on and went back to Dolan's to finish his business. And Eliza stood in the doorway of the boarding house in the December cold for a long time, looking up at the Blackstone Range and the white upper slopes where his cabin was, and trying to figure out whether what she felt was hope or just the dangerous thing that felt like hope before it wasn't. She had been wrong about that difference before. She stood there until the cold drove her in. Then she went to find Vera. Well, Vera Colton did not cry when Eliza told her. She sat at the kitchen table with both hands around her coffee cup and listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which for Vera was itself a kind of gravity. When Eliza finished, Vera was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You sure?" "No," Eliza said. Vera nodded, like that was the correct answer. "Good. Anyone who's sure about something like this before they've done it is either lying to you or to themselves." She looked into her cup. "Gideon Crow is a difficult man." "I know. Not mean, not broken. Just, he's got his own way of doing things and his own way of seeing things, and he doesn't adjust much for company." "I noticed." Vera looked up at her. "You're not adjusting much for company either." Eliza didn't say anything to that. "That might be why it works," Vera said. She stood up, which meant the emotional portion of the conversation was finished and they were moving into practical territory. "You've got wages owed through end of week. I'll pay you the full week. You'll need it." Eliza started to say she didn't need the full week, and Vera gave her a look that stopped that sentence before it left her mouth. "Take the money," Vera said. "You're going up a mountain in December with a man most of this town has decided to be angry at. Take the money." She left on a Thursday morning, 8 days after Gideon had asked her. He came down to collect her with Burl and a second animal, a sturdy gray mare he'd borrowed from the Colton brothers that he said was better on the upper trail in snow than any horse he'd tried. He loaded her travel case and her canvas bag without ceremony and checked the mare's shoes while she said goodbye to Vera in the kitchen doorway. Vera handed her a small package wrapped in cloth. "Dried apples and some hard cheese," she said, "for the trip up." Eliza took it. She started to say something and found she didn't have the right words for it, which didn't happen to her often. Vera seemed to understand this and didn't wait for it. "Come down when you need to," Vera said. "I'm not going anywhere." They went up the main road in the early morning cold, Eliza on the mare and Gideon on Burl, and the town watched them go. She knew it was watching. She didn't look at it. At the north end of town, just before the road started its first real grade, she passed close enough to Dolan's to see Ruth Aldridge standing on the store porch with Margaret beside her, both of them watching with expressions that Eliza had seen before. Not quite contempt, but the particular set of a face that has decided something and is satisfied with the decision. She looked at them briefly, because looking away would have been the wrong move, and then she looked forward and kept going. Basam. The trail up to Gideon's place took 3 hours at the pace they kept, and it was not a comfortable 3 hours. The path was narrow in sections and the snow was uneven. Solid crust in the open areas and softer, deceptive pockets in the tree shadows. And the mare was careful but not entirely relaxed about it. Eliza was a competent rider but not an experienced mountain rider, and the difference was noticeable in the first hour. Gideon rode ahead on the trickier sections and waited at the wider points. He didn't hover and he didn't coach her unless she needed it, which she appreciated. There was a particular condescension that competent people sometimes deployed when watching someone less competent do a thing, and he didn't have it. Halfway up, on a flat section where the trail widened and the trees opened to give a view back down into the valley, she stopped the mare for a moment to give the animal a rest and looked back at Creekfall below. It was small from here, just the scatter of weathered buildings along the main road, the smoke from chimneys rising straight up in the cold, still air. Gideon stopped beside her. He looked down at it, too. "You can see most of the valley from up here," she said. "On clear days, you can see all the way to the Harmon Junction." She looked at the town for another moment. "Do you miss it, when you're up here?" "Miss what?" "Being around people." He thought about it, which she had already identified as a characteristic of him. He actually thought before answering rather than producing whatever the obvious answer was. "Sometimes I miss the option of it," he said. "Not the actual thing, just knowing it's there." "That's honest." "Seemed worth being honest about," he said. He looked at her. "Do you?" She considered it. "I've spent a lot of time around people and not felt less alone for it," she said, "so probably not in the way most people mean." He was quiet for a moment. Then he clicked to Burl, and they went on up. What? The cabin was not what she'd imagined, which meant it was both better and worse in specific ways. Better. It was solidly built, with the particular care of someone who had built it to last rather than to look like it was built to last, which were different things. The logs were tight. The roof had a good pitch for snow. The south wall that he'd mentioned, but the perpetually problematic one, was visible when she looked at it, but he'd shored it recently and the repair was competent. Worse, it was small. Not unlivably small, but the kind of small that required two people to have either very compatible habits or a high tolerance for each other's presence in ways they couldn't always predict. The main room served as kitchen and sitting room. Off the main room there were 2 doors, his room, and the second room he'd said would be hers. He showed her the second room without ceremony. It had a narrow bed with a corn husk mattress, a small chest of drawers, and a hook on the wall. The window faced east and got morning light. "It's not much," he said. "It's more than I had at 18, she said, which was true and which she said without self-pity, just as a factual comparison. He looked at her for a moment. "I'll put another hook in if you need it." "That would be good," she said. She unpacked her travel case and her canvas bag, and hung what needed hanging and put what needed storing in the chest of drawers. And by the time she came back out to the main room, he had the fire built up, and there was something on the stove that smelled like it had been planned in advance. "You cooked?" she said. "I put a pot on before I came down this morning," he said, with the brief, slightly defensive tone of a man who didn't want to make a thing of having done something considerate. "What is it?" "Venison stew. It's not—" He stopped. "It smells good," she said, which it did. They ate at the table in the main room, and the conversation was not the same as it had been in Vera's kitchen. There was a different quality to talking in a place you were both occupying, a higher stake to the silences, more awareness of the physical space between you. But it wasn't bad. It was just new, and new things had a texture that you had to get used to before you could assess them properly. The first 2 weeks were a process of learning each other's patterns without discussing it. She was an early riser. So was he. But she beat him to the kitchen most mornings by 15 minutes, and she had the stove going by the time he came out, and that became the arrangement without either of them proposing it. He took the heavier outdoor work, the woodpile, the animal care, the trail maintenance, and she took the interior and the cooking, but not in the rigid, unspoken way it often worked between frontier men and women, where it was simply assumed and resentment built around the assumption. They talked about what needed doing each day and divided it by who was better placed to do it, which was more reasonable than most arrangements she'd seen. She found things she was useful for that she hadn't anticipated. The south wall needed attention beyond what he'd done. There was a moisture problem in the lower logs that was going to be worse in spring if not addressed now, and she'd seen that problem before and knew what to do about it. She told him, and he looked at it and agreed, and they spent a full day on it together, which was how she discovered that working alongside him was not difficult. He didn't explain things you hadn't asked him to explain. He didn't take over tasks you were doing competently. He just worked. "You've done this before," he said, at one point, watching her work the chinking mixture into a gap. "I told you I had." "I know, I believed you. I'm just noting it." She looked at him sideways. "Is that your version of a compliment?" "It's an observation," he said, and she caught something at the edge of his expression that was almost amusement. "Close enough," she said, and went back to the work. In the third week, the social cost of Gideon's choice started arriving in concrete ways. Thomas Beaumont sent word up by way of the Colton brothers' youngest, who made the supply run twice a month. Owen Aldridge had been talking to the men who held the grazing rights on the lower southern slope. The rights were a leasing arrangement that Gideon had held for 3 years without issue. Good pasture for summer cattle, cheap terms, easy management. Aldridge had apparently suggested to the rights holder, a man named Calder, who had taken the land in a debt settlement and had no personal feeling about it, that he might consider alternative arrangements. Gideon read the note from Beaumont at the kitchen table while Eliza was mending one of her work shirts. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Something wrong?" she said. He handed her the note. She read it. She had been around enough land and money to understand what it meant. "He's trying to cut your summer grazing." "He's suggesting it to Calder," Gideon said. "Calder might not go along with it." "Will he?" Gideon was quiet. "Calder's a practical man. If Aldridge offers him better terms, he'll take them." Eliza set down the mending. "This is because of me." "This is because Aldridge doesn't like being told no," Gideon said, and there was an edge in his voice that was not directed at her, but it was there. "He was looking for a lever before you arrived. He just found one." "That's a careful way of saying it is because of me." He looked at her directly. "It's because of a choice I made. That's different." She looked back at him. "Gideon, I can go back down." "I know you can," he said. "I'm not asking you to." "I'm not—" She stopped. She was trying to determine whether she was offering because she meant it or because she was performing the kind of selflessness that preemptively deflected blame. She had done that before, offered to leave things before she was pushed out of them, to preserve some small measure of having chosen it herself. She was not sure which this was. "What do you want?" he asked. Direct, like he always was. She sat with it for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving through the upper trees with a sound like pressure building. "I want to stay," she said. "I'm just telling you what it's costing." "I know what it's costing," he said. "I can do the math." He picked up the note and folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. "I'll go down and talk to Calder before Aldridge does." He went down 2 days later. She stayed up at the cabin, which was its own kind of test. Being alone at altitude in a place that wasn't entirely familiar yet, with the wind intermittently asserting itself against the south wall and the nearest other person 3 hours down a mountain. She did not mind it the way she thought she might. She had the work, and the work was concrete, and concrete work was good company. She fixed the loose hinge on the shed door. She inventoried the food stores and did the arithmetic of what they needed and what would last and wrote it out on the back of an old supply list. She found a split in one of the water barrel staves and repaired it with a strip of rawhide soaked soft. She also, alone in the cabin in the late afternoon when the light came through the east window at an angle that made the main room look almost warm, sat at the kitchen table and looked at the 2 cups on the shelf above the stove and thought about what she was doing here. Not regretfully, just honestly. She was 31 years old and she had spent a long time moving between situations that were survivable and situations that were slightly better than survivable, and she had gotten good at that kind of life, at reading environments quickly, at making herself useful before anyone could question whether she belonged, at keeping her expectations calibrated low enough that disappointment was never catastrophic. She was good at surviving. She was not sure she was good at this. This being staying somewhere, trusting that something that seemed good would stay good, letting a person matter before she knew for certain they wouldn't eventually cost more than she had. She didn't resolve anything sitting there at the table, but she stayed with the honesty of it for a while instead of putting it aside, which was something. Gideon came back the following afternoon and reported that Calder had listened and not committed, which meant Aldridge hadn't gotten there first, but also hadn't been refused. It was a suspended state that satisfied nobody. "He's going to take the better offer," Eliza said. "Probably. Then we need to figure out what happens to your summer operation without the lower south pasture." He looked at her, and she saw the slight recalibration again, the look that happened when she said something that surprised him by being practical rather than emotional. "We," he said. "Is that wrong?" she said, and there was a careful quality to the question, not aggressive, just checking. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "it's not wrong." They spent the evening at the kitchen table with a rough map of the range that he'd drawn himself over the years, working through what the upper pasture could sustain and what the numbers looked like without the leased land. It was not a comfortable calculation. It was possible, tight but possible, if they were careful and if the summer grass on the upper slopes was adequate, which was not guaranteed. At some point past 9 in the evening, Eliza looked up from the map and realized they had been at this for 3 hours, and the fire had burned down without either of them noticing, and the room had gotten cold in the way rooms got cold in the upper range when you stopped paying attention to the fire. She got up and put 2 more logs on without saying anything, and when she turned back, Gideon was watching her with an expression that was hard to read exactly, but that had something in it she hadn't seen directed at her before. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. And then, after a pause, "I'm glad you're here." She stood by the stove for a moment with the fire starting to come back up behind her. "Don't make it strange," she said. Something that was definitely a smile crossed his face, brief and real. "I'm not making it strange. You were about to." "I wasn't." She sat back down at the table. "Fine," she said. "I'm glad I'm here too." They went back to the map. Outside, the wind had settled, and the mountain was quiet around the cabin, and the cold held the way it held at altitude, patient and permanent, and not especially interested in what 2 people were deciding inside a small room lit by firelight. Sure, January came in hard. Not the gradual negotiated kind of cold that gives you time to prepare, but the sudden declarative kind. 3 days of clear sky followed by a temperature drop that arrived overnight like a decision that had already been made. Gideon checked the sky on the morning of January 4th and said, without drama, that they needed to bring the remaining firewood in from the outer stack before noon. They did. And it was good that they did, because by evening the wind had started, and by midnight it was something else entirely. Eliza lay in her narrow bed and listened to the cabin take the storm's pressure and felt the particular unease of being in a structure you couldn't fully assess yet, wondering which sounds were normal, which were warnings, whether the south wall was doing what it was supposed to do. She had checked the chinking herself. She knew the work was sound, but knowing and feeling were different things at midnight in the dark, with the wind finding every possible gap. She got up twice to check the stove. The second time, she found Gideon already in the main room, feeding it. "I was going to do that," she said. "I know," he said. He didn't say anything about her being up, and she didn't say anything about him being up, and they sat for a while in the firelight while the storm worked outside. At some point he said, "The south wall's going to be fine." "I know," she said. "You keep checking it." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. "It's a reasonable thing to check." She pulled her blanket tighter and looked at the fire. "I'm not good at trusting work I can't see anymore," she said. "Once it's done and sealed up, I lose track of whether I did it right." "You did it right," he said. "You checked it?" "After you were done, yes." She looked at him. "You didn't tell me that." "You didn't ask." She sat with that for a moment. The fact of him checking her work, not as oversight, but as the kind of quiet backup that a careful person did when the stakes were real. "And?" "It was good work," he said. "Better than what I'd done the first time." She didn't say anything. She looked back at the fire. "That's not a small thing," he said, "on this wall." "I know," she said, and this time she meant it differently than the other times she'd said it that night. The storm lasted 4 days, and during those 4 days, the world contracted to the size of the cabin and whatever was immediately outside it. They fell into a rhythm that was both practical and oddly domestic. Meals, fire management, checking on the animals in the shed, the specific maintenance that a structure required under sustained weather pressure. They talked when there was something to say and were quiet when there wasn't, and Eliza noticed that the silences had changed quality from the first week. They were less careful now, less like two people managing the space between them, and more like two people who had stopped noticing it. On the third day, she was at the kitchen table working on the supply inventory when he came in from the shed stamping snow off his boots, and said, without preamble, Calder took the deal. She set down her pencil. "When did you find out?" "Note came with the Colton supply yesterday. I've been sitting on it." "Why?" "Because there wasn't anything to do about it while the storm was running," he said. "And telling you sooner just meant more time worrying about a thing neither of us could address." She looked at him. "That's a very deliberate decision." "Most of my decisions are deliberate," he said, without any particular pride in it, just as a statement of practice. She picked up her pencil again, then put it back down. "All right, what does losing Calder's land actually mean for the summer numbers?" "It means the upper pasture has to carry what it wasn't designed to carry," he said. "Or I reduce the herd. Or both. Reducing the herd is a loss you don't recover from in one season." "No." "So the question is whether the upper pasture can be improved." He sat down across from her. "Some. Not enough, probably." "What would it take to make it enough?" He described it. The specific work, the time, the materials. It was not impossible. It was the kind of problem that had a solution if you were willing to do a lot of hard work for a result you wouldn't fully see until summer, which was exactly the kind of problem that separated people who could think in seasons from people who couldn't. Eliza listened to all of it and then said, "Then that's what we do." "It's a lot of work." "I know what a lot of work is," she said, and there was no edge in it, just the flat simplicity of someone stating a qualification they actually had. He looked at her for a moment across the table, and then he nodded. "All right," he said. The storm broke on the morning of the 5th day and left everything different, the way serious storms always did, not just depositing snow, but rearranging the entire landscape's geometry. Drifts had moved. The trail markers he'd placed were buried in places and weirdly exposed in others. The shed needed digging out. They spent the first clear day on basic restoration, and by evening were tired in the satisfying, uncomplicated way that physical work produced. Eliza's hands had stopped hurting from the cold the way they had in the first weeks. She was callousing back up in the specific way of mountain work, and she found she didn't mind it. After dinner, Gideon said he was going to go down to Creek Fall in the morning. There were things they needed that couldn't wait, and he wanted to hear what else had been moving in town while they'd been storm-bound. "I'll come," she said. He looked at her. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "I'll come." Besh. They came down the following morning, and what Eliza noticed first was that Creek Fall was louder than it had been before the storm. Not in actual sound, but in the way people occupied space differently when they were worried. Small clusters of men outside Dolan's. Vera at her door watching the road. a kind of suspended collective attention that she recognized as a settlement waiting for news. Del Whitaker came across the road when he saw Gideon and spoke quickly. There had been families stuck in the upper passes, the Hartley group, 6 adults and 4 children, who had been trying to get down from their winter camp before the storm hit and hadn't made it. Word had come down via the Colton brothers' ranch hand, who had found evidence of their camp but not the people. They'd been 3 days without contact. Gideon listened to this without interrupting. His face did the thing it did when he was processing something serious, not blank exactly, but very still, all the energy going inward. "How far up?" he said. "Colton's man put them somewhere near the Harrow Creek split," Del said. Gideon looked at Eliza briefly, then back at Del. "I know that terrain. The split has 2 overhangs if you know where to look. They might have sheltered." "Might," Del said, with the weight of a man who'd done the arithmetic on might and found it insufficient. Ruth Aldridge had appeared at the edge of the group that was gathering, and she said, with the kind of carrying voice she had, "Someone needs to go up and find those families. That's 4 children." Nobody disagreed with that. The question, left unspoken but understood, was who specifically was going to do it and how. The Harrow Creek split in January after a 4-day storm was not a casual errand. Gideon said, "I'll go." "Gideon," Eliza said quietly, "I know the terrain. I know the overhangs." He looked at her. "You stay down. You know Creek Fall better than I do at this point. If more information comes in, you'll be able to use it." She wanted to argue with this. She also recognized that it was correct. She was not the right person for the upper terrain in these conditions. Not yet, not without knowing the mountain the way he knew it. What she could do was hear. "Fine," she said, "but you take the gray mare. She's more reliable in the loose snow." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "Fair." He was gone within the hour, with the gray mare and enough supplies for 2 days, and the Colton brothers' oldest going with him, because going alone into post-storm terrain at altitude was a choice that even Gideon Crow's stubbornness had limits on. What happened in Creek Fall while Gideon was gone was something Eliza had not planned for. It started practically enough. The town was in a controlled panic. The kind where people were doing things, but the things they were doing weren't necessarily the most useful things. Owen Aldridge was organizing a second search party to go up the east route, which was the wrong route for where Del Whitaker's information pointed. Eliza listened to this for about 20 minutes, and then said, as evenly as she could manage, "The Hartley group was coming down from the north camp, not the east. If they sheltered near Harrow Creek." Aldridge looked at her. "And how would you know that?" "Because Del's man saw their camp markers, and north camp markers are different from east camp markers," she said. "I've read them." There was a pause. Aldridge looked like he was deciding whether to argue with this, and Eliza held his gaze with the particular steadiness she had developed over years of being in rooms where someone was deciding whether to take her seriously. Thomas Beaumont, standing to the side, said, "She's right about the markers. North Camp uses the double-notch system." Aldridge's search party went northeast instead of east. It was not nothing. What followed was not dramatic or organized. It was the messy improvisational management of a community under pressure. 4 other families in Creek Fall had members who hadn't checked in after the storm. Food stores at the boarding house needed to be assessed for the likelihood of extended population if people came down from the hills in bad condition. The doctor, a man named Reese, who was competent but perpetually under-equipped, needed to know what supplies he had and what he'd need. Eliza moved through all of this the way she moved through practical problems, which was without ceremony and with a great deal of attention. She talked to Vera about the boarding house stores. She talked to Reese about what he had, and helped him catalog it in a way that was actually useful rather than aspirational. When 2 women arrived from the Harmon family's outlying place, half frozen and frightened, she was the one who got them inside and warm and coherent before anyone else had sorted out where to put them. Vera watched her do all of this from various angles during the day and said nothing, which was Vera's version of a particular kind of attention. Ruth Aldridge watched too, but differently. Gideon came back on the second day, in the late afternoon, with the Hartley group. All 10 of them, 6 adults and 4 children, alive, frostbitten in places. One of the adults with a badly sprained ankle from a fall, The children scared and exhausted and hungry, but fundamentally sound. They had sheltered exactly where Gideon had thought they would, in the larger of the two Harrow Creek overhangs, and had been there since the storm started, unable to move and running low on everything. The town came out to see them come in. It was that kind of moment. The specific relief of a collective fear resolved, which has a quality that other kinds of relief don't have. People who had been short with each other all day became briefly human again. Gideon came through it without stopping. He handed off the gray mare, checked in with Del Whitaker for 30 seconds, and came directly to the boarding house where he knew Eliza was. He came through the door and looked at her, and she looked at him, and she saw that he was exhausted in the bone-deep way of someone who had been operating on pure function for 48 hours, and she said, "Sit down." He sat down. She put coffee on and didn't say anything for a moment, and then she told him about the 2 days in Creekfall, the redirected search party, the Harmon women, the supply catalog with Reese. He listened with his hands around the cup she'd put in front of him, and at the end he said, "Aldridge let you redirect his search party?" Beaumont backed me up. "Still," she shrugged. He didn't want to look wrong in front of the town more than he didn't want to take direction from me. So he took direction from me. Gideon looked at her over the cup. Something had shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a deepening of something that had been building for weeks. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You're doing the thing again." "I'm not doing anything." "You're looking at me like you're revising something." He set the cup down. "I keep revising things," he said. "That's all." She looked at him steadily. "What are you revising now?" He was quiet for a moment. The real kind of quiet, not the stalling kind. "The part where I thought I was the one who knew what I was bringing you into," he said. "Up there, in those 2 days, I was thinking about the terrain and the overhangs and how to get 10 people down a mountain. And you were down here handling everything I wasn't thinking about." "That's just division of work," she said. "It's not, though," he said. "It's, you knew what needed doing without being told what needed doing. That's different." She looked at her own hands on the table. "I've had a lot of practice figuring out what needs doing and doing it before someone decides I shouldn't be the one to do it." He heard the edge underneath that, the history in it, the years of having to be twice as practical and half as visible. He didn't try to resolve it or smooth it over. He just sat with it, which was the right thing. Outside, the town was still moving with the particular energy of crisis resolved. The Hartley children were presumably being fed somewhere. Reese was dealing with the frostbite cases. The Colton brothers' ranch hand was probably getting more credit than he deserved in the retelling. The story of the rescue was already being shaped into something cleaner than it had been. Eliza looked at the fire. She was tired in ways she hadn't fully admitted to herself yet, not just physically, but in the deeper way of someone who had been performing competence under hostile observation for weeks, and was only now, in a room with one person who wasn't watching to find fault, allowing herself to feel the cost of it. "Ruth Aldridge watched me all day," she said. "The whole time." "What did she say?" "Nothing. That's the thing. She watched, and she didn't say anything." Gideon turned his cup in his hands. "That might be worse, or it might be better. With Ruth, it's hard to know which until later." "I know," Eliza said. The fire worked quietly in the grate. Somewhere down the road, someone was calling out. A name, one of the returned families, probably, someone relieved. The sound carried and then faded. She did not know yet what Ruth Aldridge's silence meant. She did not know yet what the next weeks in Creekfall were going to look like, or whether the things she and Gideon were building, practical and careful and stubbornly unfinished, was strong enough for what the mountain still had in store. What she knew was that she was here, that the south wall was holding, that she had done 2 days of useful work under conditions that were not designed to make her feel welcome, and the work had mattered regardless. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, the most reliable kind of something. Tutsat. Ruth Aldridge's silence lasted 11 days. Eliza had learned in those 11 days not to trust it. Silence from a woman like Ruth was not neutrality. It was preparation. You didn't spend 2 decades building social authority in a small settlement and then go quiet because you'd changed your mind about something. You went quiet because you were deciding how to use what you'd seen. The town had settled into its post-crisis version of normal, which was different from its pre-crisis version in ways that were hard to name precisely, but easy to feel. The Hartley family was alive, and that meant something. The redirected search party meant something too, not openly acknowledged, but present in the way that useful things people didn't want to credit stayed present, like a debt nobody was ready to call in. Eliza moved through Creekfall on the days she came down with Gideon the way she always had, doing what needed doing, not pushing for anything, watching carefully. She had started to know the town in the way you knew a place, after enough weeks of paying attention, the timing of the foot traffic, the specific dynamics at Dolan's counter, which conversations were real and which were performances for whoever was listening. She knew, for instance, that the Hartley family's gratitude was genuine but circumscribed. Agnes Hartley, the mother of the 4 children, had thanked Eliza directly and without qualification for helping with the supply situation during the rescue days. Her husband had nodded at Gideon with the real gravity of a man who understood what had been done for his family. But they were careful about how visible that gratitude was, because they lived in Creekfall, and Creekfall had a social order, and gratitude didn't override the social order. It just made navigating it more complicated. That was the honest mathematics of it. Eliza understood it. She didn't resent it much. What she resented, a little, was how much energy it cost to understand it all the time. Ruth Aldridge's silence broke on a Thursday morning at Dolan's, which was where most things in Creekfall broke, given that it was the only place everyone eventually passed through. Eliza was at the counter, picking up thread and a length of canvas when Ruth came in with Margaret behind her. The store had 3 other people in it. A man named Pell, who ranched south of town, the widow Stokes, who kept to herself and had no allegiance to anyone's faction, and Del Whitaker, picking up the week's post. Ruth did not make a production of it. That was her particular skill. The precise damage done in a tone that sounded like mild concern. She said, loud enough to carry, "It's good of you to be coming down so regularly, Eliza. Though I do wonder sometimes what Vera thinks about her boarding house being associated with, well, the arrangement." Eliza finished counting out the coins for her purchase. She did not rush. She had learned a long time ago that rushing was what people wanted. It looked like flinching, and flinching told the room that the strike had landed. "Vera runs her own house," Eliza said. "She thinks what she thinks." "Of course," Ruth said pleasantly. "I just meant that a woman in your position, coming from where you came from, people will talk. For your sake, as much as anything." For your sake was the particular blade in it, the concern framing, the implication that Ruth was actually worried about Eliza's reputation, as if Eliza's reputation were a thing Ruth hadn't spent 3 months systematically working against. Del Whitaker had gone very still at the post window, which was his version of listening closely. "I appreciate the concern," Eliza said. She picked up her package. She looked at Ruth directly, which was the one thing you had to do, not aggressively, just without evasion, because looking away was another kind of flinch. "I'll be sure to pass along your regards to Vera." She left. Outside, the cold hit her face, and she stood for a moment in the thin January light and did the thing she always did after that kind of exchange, ran back through it to see if she'd handled it right, looking for the places where she'd been weaker or stronger than she should have been. It was a habit she'd never fully broken. The internal debrief after any room where she'd been tested. She thought she'd done all right. She also thought it wasn't over. She was correct about that. The following week, Owen Aldridge made his second move on the grazing land. This one was not through Calder. Calder had apparently decided that the whole situation was more complicated than he wanted to be involved in, and had told Aldridge the lease terms were staying as they were through spring, which meant Aldridge needed a different angle. The different angle was the water rights on the Eastern Creek feed. Gideon had a formal arrangement on the Upper Creek that had been in place for 6 years, a simple recorded document at the county office in Harmon Valley establishing his use rights on the section of creek that fed his property from the eastern slope. It was not a dramatic piece of legal territory, but without it, the spring and summer water situation at the cabin became significantly more complicated. What Aldridge had done, Thomas Beaumont's latest message explained, was file a competing claim with the county office, arguing that his recent land acquisition to the east put the creek origin on his property, which made Gideon's use rights subordinate to his ownership rights. It was the kind of legal argument that wasn't necessarily wrong. It depended on where exactly the creek originated, which was a question of survey lines and the county office's interpretation. Gideon read the message at the kitchen table with the same stillness he brought to most bad news, and Eliza read it after him and felt the specific, familiar anger of recognizing a pattern. Not the crude, hot anger of a first offense, but the colder, more sustained anger of someone watching a thing they've seen before. "He's going to keep doing this," she said. "Yes." "One angle at a time, until something sticks, or until you're exhausted." "Yes," Gideon said again. He looked at the table for a moment. "I need to go to the county office in Harmon Valley and file a response before the claim processes. The window is 30 days. "When can you go?" "Soon as possible. Weather permitting." "I'll come." He looked at her. "Harmon Valley is where you— I know where it is," she said. "I'll come." He read her face for a moment, the set of it, the specific quality of the decision in it, and then nodded. He didn't argue with her about whether it was a good idea, which she appreciated because she had already done that argument with herself and settled it. They went down to Harmon Valley 4 days later when the pass road was clear enough for the wagon. It was a full day's travel each way, which meant they went down on a Tuesday and stayed overnight at a boarding house there and came back on Wednesday. The boarding house was nothing like Vera's. It was run by a disinterested man who barely looked at them when they came in, which was its own relief after months of being watched. The county office was a small, overly warm room staffed by a clerk named Aldous, who had the permanent expression of a man who had processed too many petty land disputes and had stopped assigning moral weight to any of them. He was efficient and unhelpful in equal measure, which was probably the correct disposition for the job. Gideon laid out the response filing, and Aldous reviewed it without enthusiasm and said the counter-filing would be accepted, but that the dispute would take 30 to 60 days to process, and the outcome would depend on a survey determination that would need to be ordered separately and would cost $14. $14 was not nothing. Gideon said he'd pay it. Aldous made a note. On the way out of the office, Eliza stopped. She had been looking at the filing documents, and something about the parcel descriptions had caught her attention during the meeting, and she hadn't had time to run it down while Aldous was talking. "Wait," she said. Gideon stopped. She looked at the copies they'd been given. She was not a surveyor, and she was not a lawyer, but she had spent enough time in practical land situations, including the mess in Harmon Valley that had ended her tenure there, to read parcel descriptions with some care. "The creek origin point," she said, "the one Aldridge is claiming his property covers. What about it?" "This says the parcel boundary runs along the eastern ridgeline at the second survey marker." She looked up. "Do you know where that marker is?" "Roughly. Because if it runs along the ridge at the second marker, the creek origin is 30 feet west of his boundary line. It's not on his property at all." Gideon looked at the document. He read the section she was pointing to. His expression shifted in a way she recognized. Not excitement, but the specific concentration of someone who had just seen a thing change shape. "Aldous," he said, turning back to the door. Aldous received this observation with the demeanor of a man who was professionally unsurprised by most things, but found himself slightly less bored than usual. He compared the parcel descriptions, consulted a hand-drawn survey map that he kept in a drawer, and clearly used more than he admitted, and said, after a measured silence, that it was possible the survey determination would find in Gideon's favor. He said it the way he said everything, without commitment, but the way he said it was different enough to matter. On the way back to the boarding house, Gideon was quiet for half a block and then said, "How did you see that?" "I've read a lot of parcel descriptions," she said. "In Harmon Valley?" "And before. When you're trying to figure out if you have any standing anywhere, you learn to read the documents that say who has standing." He was quiet again. Then, "What happened in Harmon Valley? The man you mentioned. The promises." She had not expected the question in this moment. She looked at the road ahead. "Why?" "Because I'd like to know," he said. Simply, not pressing, not demanding, just stating. She thought about deflecting. She had the habit of it. She also thought about what he'd said to her months ago at Vera's kitchen table. It's a habit, there's a difference, and how correct that had been. His name was Garfield, she said. He owned the mercantile. He told me I had a permanent position and a wage, and that there was a possibility of partnership if I stayed and worked well. She kept her eyes on the road. I stayed. I worked well. When I brought up the partnership after 2 years, he said he'd never made that offer. He said I'd misunderstood. And he said it in front of his wife and 2 of his friends, and they all agreed that I'd misunderstood. And the town believed him. He'd been there 15 years. I'd been there too. She paused. And I wasn't the kind of woman that towns automatically believe. Gideon said nothing for a moment. They walked. I left before it got worse, she said. Which it would have. Once someone decides to be against you in a small place, the options narrow fast. You should have had recourse, he said, and the flatness in his voice was the specific kind of flat that covered real anger. I know, she said. I didn't. They reached the boarding house. He held the door and she went in, and neither of them said anything else about Garfield that night. But she noticed at dinner that Gideon was somewhere slightly different from where he'd been that morning. Some internal reckoning that she hadn't fully witnessed but could see the result of in the way he looked at her across the table. She didn't ask about it. Some things needed to settle before they could be named. They came back to Creekfall on Wednesday afternoon, and the town had news waiting for them that neither had anticipated. Agnes Hartley was at Vera's boarding house when they arrived, sitting in the kitchen with Vera and looking like she had been there a while. She stood up when they came in with the slightly formal air of someone who had prepared what they were going to say. I wanted to tell you, she said, looking at Eliza, what I told Ruth Aldridge this morning. Eliza stood still. I told her, Agnes said, that my children are alive because of the work done in this town during those 2 days, and that the work was done by you. She said it plainly, without decoration. I told her that I wasn't going to sit in her parlor anymore and listen to what she says about you. The room was quiet. Eliza looked at Agnes Hartley and felt something complicated move through her. Not the warm, simple gratitude she might have expected, but something more layered. The relief of being seen, tangled with the knowledge of what it cost Agnes to say it, tangled with the awareness that Ruth Aldridge would find a way to make Agnes pay some version of a price for it. You didn't have to do that, Eliza said. I know, Agnes said. That's why it meant something to do it. Vera was looking at her coffee cup with an expression that was doing considerable work to appear indifferent. Gideon stood in the doorway to the kitchen with his hat in his hand and said nothing, which was right. This was not his moment to say anything. Agnes left after a few minutes. She had her own house and her own afternoon. And when she was gone, the kitchen held the particular silence of something having shifted. Ruth won't let that stand, Eliza said. No, Vera agreed. She'll go harder. Probably. Eliza sat down at the table. She was tired. The travel, the county office, the Harmon Valley weight of being back in that town. And she was sitting in a borrowed kitchen in a borrowed chair. And the thing she was building with Gideon was still fragile and unfinished, and under sustained pressure from people with more resources and more social leverage than she had. She knew all of that. She looked at it straight. Then we go harder too, she said. She looked at Gideon. The survey. We push it through faster than 30 days. We go back to the county office next week and we push. Aldous said 30 to 60 days. Aldous said the determination would take that long. I'm saying we give Aldous a reason to move it to the front of the pile. Gideon looked at her. What kind of reason? The kind you make by showing up and knowing the documents better than the person processing them, she said. We bring the original survey records. We bring the creek documentation. We make it easier for him to resolve it quickly than to let it sit. Gideon put his hat on the table. All right, he said. All right, Vera echoed, to nobody in particular, and got up to refill the coffee. Outside, Creekfall moved through its afternoon in the way small towns moved. The slow, accretive motion of people doing things that would matter later in ways they couldn't fully see yet. The Aldridge house sat at the north end of the main road, solid and self-certain, the smoke from its chimney rising straight in the cold, still air. And in Vera's kitchen, 3 people sat around a table that had held a lot of difficult conversations, and the coffee was hot, and the plan was imperfect, and it was the best thing they had. The second trip to Harmon Valley happened on a Tuesday, 8 days after the first. Eliza had spent those 8 days doing what she'd said she would do, gathering the original survey records, the creek documentation, the 6-year history of Gideon's use rights filed in proper order. She was systematic about it in a way that came from knowing how these things worked, how a clerk like Aldous processed information, how to make the correct answer the path of least resistance rather than the path of most work. You didn't argue with a bureaucrat. You made their job easier in the direction you needed. Gideon watched her organize the documents at the kitchen table the night before they left and said, "Where did you learn this?" It wasn't quite a question. It was the form a question took when someone had been wondering something for a while and had finally decided to say it out loud. "Garfield kept poor records," she said without looking up. "When I realized what he was doing, I started keeping good ones. On everything. For 2 years. She smoothed a document flat. It didn't help me in the end because the problem wasn't the records. The problem was that nobody wanted to look at them. She looked up. Here, someone might. He was quiet for a moment. "You've been thinking about this since the county office." "I've been thinking about this since Aldridge filed the claim," she said. "I just needed the right room to think in." Aldous received them on Tuesday morning with the same practiced indifference as before, but Eliza had anticipated this and did not try to overcome it. She simply laid the documents out in the order she'd prepared them. Survey records first, then the creek documentation with the specific boundary language flagged, then the 6-year use history, then the original filing that predated Aldridge's land acquisition by 4 years. She walked Aldous through it the way she'd walk someone through a repair job, not telling them what to conclude, just making sure they saw every relevant piece in the right sequence. Aldous looked at the boundary language. He looked at his survey map. He looked at the creek origin coordinates. The room was quiet except for the sound of paper moving and the stove working in the corner. "The second marker," he said after a while. "Yes," Eliza said. "That puts the origin outside the Aldridge parcel. By approximately 30 feet based on the recorded coordinates." Aldous set down the document. He looked at it a moment longer. "I can process this as a straightforward boundary determination rather than a dispute," he said. "That timeline is shorter, 10 days instead of 30. "We'd appreciate that," Eliza said. He made a note. He did not look particularly moved by the situation, but he did not look resistant to it either. He looked like a man who had just found the path of least resistance and had chosen it, which was exactly what she had been trying to produce. Outside in the cold Harmon Valley street, Gideon stood beside her for a moment looking at the county office door. 10 days, he said. 10 days, she confirmed. He looked at her. "You did that." "We did that," she said. "You had 6 years of clean documentation. Without that, there was nothing to present. You organized it. You kept it." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that direction, and she felt the specific warmth of a moment that didn't need to be made more than it was. They went to get the horses. Creekfall, when they came back, had moved without them in the way small towns always moved when something was pending, sideways, accumulating pressure in corners, waiting. Agnes Hartley had apparently continued what she'd started, not loudly, not in any organized way, but in the persistent daily way of a woman who had made a decision and was not reversing it. She had said what she'd said to Ruth Aldridge, and then kept saying versions of it in the smaller conversations that made up a town's actual social life. At the well, in the mercantile, at the gatherings where Creekfall women processed the community's ongoing business together. Vera reported this to Eliza without editorializing, which was Vera's version of high praise for Agnes Hartley. Ruth Aldridge's response had been, predictably, to apply pressure. She had stopped extending the Hartley family's store credit through her husband's account, which was a real and practical consequence that Agnes had apparently absorbed without reversing course. Owen Aldridge had made pointed remarks to James Hartley at the feed store about reliable neighbors and community obligations, the kind of remarks that sounded like advice but functioned like warnings. James Hartley was a quiet man who weighed things carefully. He had listened to Owen Aldridge's remarks and then gone home and talked to his wife, and then the following Sunday had gone to Thomas Beaumont's place and had a conversation that Beaumont later summarized for Gideon in characteristically few words. "Hartley's with you." Beaumont himself had been quietly busy. He had talked to the Colton brothers, who had their own reasons for being tired of Aldridge's expanding reach into the valley's land arrangements. Aldridge had made overtures about the Colton grazing boundaries too, 2 years back, which had been repelled but not forgotten. He had talked to Del Whitaker, who was not a man who took sides in social disputes, but who had strong opinions about the proper functioning of county records and water rights, and who had listened to the description of Aldridge's filing strategy with visible displeasure. None of this was organized. There was no meeting, no declared alliance. It was just the way a community's honest accounting eventually surfaced when the pressure became steady enough, people deciding one by one in their own time what they actually thought about something. The survey determination came back in 9 days, 1 day early. It found, as Eliza had argued it would, that the creek origin fell outside the Aldridge parcel boundary by 32 feet. Gideon's water rights were confirmed as valid and uncontested. The competing claim was dismissed. Aldous sent the document up by way of the county mail system, which meant it came through Del Whitaker's post office, which meant Del Whitaker read the summary notation on the cover and knew the outcome before almost anyone else. Del was not a man who gossiped, but he was a man who believed in the efficient distribution of accurate information, so by the time Eliza came in to collect it that afternoon, Thomas Beaumont already knew. And by evening, the Colton brothers knew, and by the following morning, Creekfall generally knew. Eliza read the document at Vera's kitchen table with Gideon across from her, and Vera pointedly doing other things at the far end of the kitchen. She read it twice. Then she set it down. "It's done," she said. "It's done," Gideon said. She sat with it for a moment. She had learned not to feel too much in the immediate aftermath of a thing going right, because the habit of bracing for reversal was deeply built into her, and allowing relief too quickly felt like leaving yourself exposed. But she also recognized that habit for what it was. And she tried, deliberately and with some effort, to let the good thing be good. "He'll try something else," she said. "Not as despair, just as honesty." "Maybe," Gideon said. "But he spent 3 moves on us and come away with nothing. At some point the math stops working for him." "He might not think in math." "Aldridge thinks entirely in math. That's why he's been so predictable." She looked at him. "You've been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about this since December," he said. He's a man who runs calculations. He went after the grazing lease first because it was the lowest cost move with the most leverage. When that didn't work, he went after the water rights because they were the next most critical thing. If the water rights failed, the next logical move would be the road access to the upper trail. But that runs through the Colton property line, and the Coltons won't play. "You mapped this out." "I had a long winter." She laughed. Actually laughed. The short, real kind. And the sound surprised them both slightly. She didn't laugh often, and she was aware of that. It was not something she'd managed easily in recent years. Gideon was looking at her with an expression she had seen building for months and had never quite been able to name. It was not the evaluating look, the one she'd noticed from the beginning. It was something past that, the look of a man who had finished revising and had arrived somewhere settled. "What?" she said. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Again." She recognized the echo of that phrasing. He had said it once before, in Vera's doorway, on a December afternoon that felt much longer ago than it was. She waited. "I want to formalize the arrangement," he said. "The cabin, the land, everything we've been building up there. I want your name on it alongside mine." He said it the way he said most things, directly and without ornament, but with the specific weight of someone who had thought about the words carefully. Not because of the legal protection, though that's real. Because it's yours. The work you've done up there, the work you did here during the rescue, what you did at the county office, that land should belong to the person who understands it. You understand it. She was quiet. "I'm not making a speech," he said. "I know what it is, and I know what it isn't. It's 2 imperfect people on a difficult piece of ground trying to build something that doesn't fall down. I'm asking if you want to do that as a permanent thing." She looked at the survey document on the table between them. She looked at her own hands, the calluses, the healed palm where she'd fallen on the icy path that first morning, the evidence of months of work in a place she hadn't known and was now beginning to know, the way you knew a place when you'd put real effort into it. She thought about 18 years old and leaving her family's farm with nothing. She thought about the years between there and here, the calculations, the survivable situations, The careful management of expectations down to the level where disappointment couldn't reach. She thought about how much of her life she had spent being practically invisible and being fine with it because fine was the best available option. And she thought about a man in a kitchen doorway in December who had said, "I'm not asking you to make promises," and who had then spent months demonstrating in the specific, unspectacular language of daily behavior that he was actually the kind of person who kept them. "Yes," she said. Vera, at the far end of the kitchen, set down whatever she was holding with a small, deliberate sound that was approximately as close as she was going to get to a celebration. They married in March, when the passes had cleared and the worst of the winter had finally decided it was finished. It was a simple thing. A civil record at the county office, Aldous processing the paperwork with his characteristic neutrality, Thomas Beaumont and Del Whitaker as witnesses because they were both men who kept their word, and Gideon wanted witnesses who kept their word. Vera came. Agnes Hartley came with her husband, and the Colton brothers sent their oldest with a bottle of decent whiskey and a note that said about time in the Colton brothers' collective handwriting. Creek Falls' reaction was mixed, which was the honest version of how these things went. The Aldridge faction had nothing left to spend on it. The water rights determination had cost them the argument, and Ruth Aldridge had the social intelligence to know when a position was no longer defensible. She did not attend. She sent nothing. She also, notably, stopped saying things. It was not acceptance. It was the particular silence of someone who had made their calculation and found the return no longer justified the investment. That was enough. Eliza had never needed Ruth Aldridge's approval. She had only ever needed her to stop. The people who came to the brief gathering at Vera's boarding house afterward were the people who mattered in the specific way that mattered. Not the most powerful or the most socially significant, but the ones who had made deliberate choices about where they stood. Agnes Hartley, who had cost herself store credit for it. Thomas Beaumont, who had spent 30 years in Creek Fall and knew exactly what his quiet backing was worth. The Colton brothers' oldest, who shook Gideon's hand with the frank respect of one competent man for another, and told Eliza she'd done good work on the water rights filing, which, coming from a Colton, was a statement of high regard. Vera served food and did not cry, maintaining her record. Spring came to the upper range the way it always came. Not gently, not in any of the soft ways that the word implied, but in the aggressive, contested manner of a season that had to fight for every degree of warmth against a mountain that wasn't ready to give it up. The snow didn't so much melt as surrender, slowly and grudgingly, leaving behind a landscape that was all mud and exposed rock, and the surprising stubborn green of things that had been waiting under all that white. Eliza and Gideon worked the upper pasture through April and into May. The work was exactly what he had described, more than one person's worth, requiring the kind of sustained effort that left you genuinely tired at the end of every day. They extended the grass on the north-facing section by clearing scrub and working in the soil amendment that Gideon had been saving. They repaired the fencing that the winter had damaged. They rebuilt the section of trail that had washed out in the spring runoff, which took 5 days and was the hardest physical work Eliza had done since she arrived in the range. Her hands were different now from the hands she'd had in November. The work had finished something the earlier months had started. She noticed it one morning in May, looking at them before she put her gloves on, and she thought about the woman who had stood in Creek Falls main road with a patched travel case and done the arithmetic of how different a place was from what you'd expected. She had expected less than this. She had been wrong, which was not something she was wrong about often, and she found she was glad to have been wrong. The summer cattle operation worked, not easily. The Calder grazing loss had been real, and the upper pasture had pushed its capacity. But it worked because they'd done the preparation, and because Eliza had a gift for the specific management that made the difference between a borderline operation and a functional one. She kept numbers. She tracked condition. She made decisions in the small daily way that either saved things or didn't, and mostly it saved things. By the time the first cold came again, a gentle warning version in September, nothing like what January had been, the operation had produced what Gideon had said was a decent season, and what Eliza had privately calculated was better than decent. In October, Creek Fall held a fall gathering, a regular event, more functional than festive, the kind of collective taking stock that frontier settlements needed before winter closed things down. Who had what? What was needed? Who could provide what for whom? Eliza went with Gideon, which was no longer notable in the way it had once been. They were simply a presence in the town now, a known quantity. The strangeness of them had worn into familiarity, which was how most strange things eventually went in a community small enough that you couldn't avoid knowing each other. At some point during the gathering, Owen Aldridge appeared beside Gideon with the careful air of a man who had prepared a version of himself in advance. He said something about a productive season. He said something about the range being a demanding place, and that men who could make it work deserved respect for it. He said it in the controlled, face-saving way of a man who was not apologizing but was repositioning, which Gideon received with the neutral acknowledgement of a man who understood the transaction without requiring it to be more than it was. Aldridge looked at Eliza briefly and nodded. She nodded back. That was the entirety of it. No confession, no reckoning, no moment where Owen Aldridge said what he had done and why and what it had cost. Life was not structured to produce those moments, and she had stopped expecting them. What she had instead was the practical reality. The water rights were hers. The land was hers. The work of the season had proven what it had proven, and Aldridge standing here making a calculated peace with the outcome was itself a form of acknowledgement, even if it was a coward's form. She could live with that. What she could not have lived with, and she thought about this later on the ride back up to the cabin in the early October cold, was having spent her life in the half-life of permanent survival mode. Moving from one barely sufficient situation to the next, useful but invisible, capable but never in a place where capability was allowed to accumulate into something real. She had spent 12 years being the kind of person who made things work for other people and had almost nothing to show for it at the end, because the places she'd made things work had never belonged to her. Not legally, not socially, not in any of the ways that turned work into life. This was different. This was hers in a way that nothing before had been. Not because a man had given it to her. Gideon had not given her anything she hadn't earned on its specific merits. Not the work, not the respect, not the land. What he had done was something harder to name and more important. He had been the first person in a very long time to look at her without the particular set of assumptions that her body, her history, and her social position had always produced in people who saw those things first. He had looked at what she did and what she knew and how she thought, and he had found it sufficient. More than sufficient. That was not rescue. That was just accurate seeing. She had spent enough time being inaccurately seen that the accurate version felt, at first, too good to trust. She understood now that the distrust had been the last piece of damage she'd been carrying, the reflex to brace for the moment when the accurate scene would revert, when he would see her the way others had. That moment had not come. Not in a winter, not in a spring, not in a summer of hard work and daily proximity. Maybe it never would. She could not guarantee it, and she was too honest with herself to pretend she could. But she had been building something real with both hands for almost a year, and the structure was holding. The cabin in the upper range sat quiet in the October evening, the stove going, the season's accounts settled at the table, the 2 cups on the shelf above the stove that had been there since November when they were still careful with each other. Gideon said, "Next spring we should extend the south fence line. The upper pasture can carry more if we push it another quarter section." Eliza looked at the rough map between them. "The drainage runs wrong in that quarter. We'd need to address that first or lose the grass to standing water in the melt." "How long would that take?" 2 weeks, maybe 3, if we start early." He nodded. He made a note on the edge of the map. She watched his hand move and thought about all the small decisions that had accumulated into this life. Each one provisional, each one a bet on something that wasn't certain. And she thought that this was probably what most lives were, when you looked at them honestly. Not a story with a clear arc and a lesson at the end. Just a series of daily choices, some of them right and some of them wrong, slowly building something that was worth the trouble. The fire worked steadily. The mountain held the cabin the way it held everything in the range. Without sentiment, without guarantees, but with the solid fact of its presence. Outside, the first real cold of the season was settling in, patient and permanent. Inside, there was enough warmth. That was sufficient. That was, she had finally learned, exactly enough.